40 years. So when I met his widow, she had given me a number of family photographs that I had never seen, and a lot of documents, family documents, including some immigration papers that my great-grandparents had filled out back in 1908. And I had always thought that my grandmother's heritage, my father's mother, I had always thought that her heritage was Polish. And I'm going through these documents, and I'm seeing, okay, Louise Jedlicka, Bohemia. That's not Poland. So I called up my sister, who's 9 years older than me. I was 6 years old when my parents split. My sister was 15. So she had a lot more memory of that time than I did. And I said, Deb, I thought Grandma was Polish. She said, what are you talking about? I said, I always thought she was Polish. She said, where'd you get that out of? He said, I have no idea. I said, why do you bring this up? She didn't even know I was asking the question because I had never talked about that side of the family in many years. I said, well, I got these documents from Dad's widow, and I'm looking at these immigration papers, and it says Bohemia. She goes, yeah. I'm like, why did I think that? And she goes, I have no idea. So I had a memory for more than 40 years, closer to 50 years, that was just simply wrong. And it really bugged me for like 2 days. I mean, it really bugged me. It's like, I'm going back to this time in my life now, which there was a lot of big changes happening in our family, and I'm thinking, if I remembered that wrong, what else might I have remembered that was not correct? You know, I remembered it in a certain way, but factually that wasn't the way it happened. So I started my own journey of self-study into false memories. And after I kind of worked my way through that, I got into looking into a number of different cognitive biases that we have, including stereotyping and all other kinds of things, authority bias and a number of different things. And so I put together that presentation back in 2018 after a couple of years of self-study on it. And when Joanne and I were talking about, well, what might we do for another event, we thought it was good timing because of 2020 being an election year and how the biases that we bring to what we're receiving in through the media and in conversations that we have with other people, we may not be open and receptive to listening to what's being said, but only what we want to hear. So I have a very brief presentation about what cognitive bias is, what it's not, and some examples of that. And then we'll get into some more specifics of our own particular situations. I'll have something that I want to discuss. I'll go more into my false memory experience. Then Kate will have something she would like to discuss, and then Joanne, and then Karen. And then Karen will be giving us some information on how we can handle our biases when we discover them and what's a good way of working through them. So may I have the first slide, please? Thank you. So cognitive bias is as you can see on the screen behind me, a systematic pattern of deviation from norm or rationality of judgment. Individuals create their own subjective social reality from their perception of the input. Keyword there is the perception of the input. An individual's construction of social reality, not the objective input, may dictate their behavior in the social world. Thus, cognitive biases may sometimes lead to perpetual distortion, inaccurate judgment, illogical interpretation, or what is broadly called irrationality. Now, you'll also note that the definition says that cognitive bias sometimes lead to perceptual distortion. Psychologists have identified nearly 200 different cognitive biases, and we'll have a handout for you as you leave that has a listing of a lot of those and some resources that you, if you're interested, you can look up on the internet. But it says it sometimes leads to perceptual distortion. Just because we have a bias doesn't necessarily mean that we're wrong. So I might have a bias about a particular political issue, and I've already made up my mind about it, we'll say, for example. Information comes in, I disagree with what I'm hearing, and if I bring my bias to that and say, well, I've got a bias against what this person is, who they stand for, or whatever, I'm just going to dismiss it out of hand. Well, I might be right, I might be wrong. That's when it comes to us needing to really just being open to listen and then checking up on what people say rather than just already making up our minds. So if I may have the next slide, please. There's basically four major categories of cognitive biases. And the first category is when we're receiving in too much information. We notice things that are already primed in our memory or we've heard many times. Bizarre, funny, visually striking, or anthropomorphic things stick out more than the non-bizarre or unfunny things. Anything that's unusual, you're going to remember more. We notice when things have changed. We are drawn to details that confirm our own existing beliefs, which is a confirmation bias. I think many people might have heard of that. And we notice flaws in others more than we notice the flaws in ourselves. And we'll talk about that a lot, I'm sure, about that tonight. May I have the next slide, please? The next category is not enough meaning. And we tend to find stories and patterns even when looking at sparse data. So we want to make sense of things in terms that we can understand. And if we've only got a little bit of information, we tend to want to fill in the blanks with what we think we're seeing. We fill in the characteristics from stereotypes, generalities, and prior histories of things that we do know. We imagine things and people we're familiar with or fond of as better, not only better than other things we're comparing them to, but better than they maybe we are perceiving them to be. We simplify numbers and probabilities to make them easier to think about. We think we know what other people are thinking, which is almost always wrong. And we project our current mindset and assumptions onto the past and to the future. May I have the next slide, please? Next category is the need to act quickly. To act, we must be confident that we can make an impact and feel what we do is important. We have to stay focused. We favor the immediate and relatable thing that's in front of us. To get things done, we tend to complete things we've invested time and energy in. And to avoid mistakes, we aim to preserve autonomy and group status and avoid irreversible decisions. We favor simple-looking options and complete information over complex and ambiguous options. And again, you'll have information, as a take-home packet that's got a lot more on all of this. May I have the next slide, please? And the last one is, last major category is what things that we need to remember. We edit and reinforce some memories after the fact. We discard specifics to form generalities. We reduce events and lists to their key elements, and we store memories differently based on how they were experienced. And I know Karen is going to have a lot to talk about that one, too. So the last thing that I wanted to discuss was how do we manage these cognitive biases? There's a number of ways that we can do so. And just having an awareness that such a thing even exists is a good first step. It's good to also know that there's not a consensus among experts, so there's not one book you can read and says, oh, this is going to tell me what I need to know. If you do have interest, again, in the packet, there's a lot of resources you can do some reading. Of course, walking a mile in another person's shoes, just try and have some empathy for what another person is experiencing or may know that you don't. Not to obsess about it like I did for 2 days. And then just learn and grow and go on from there. And the last slide, please. The 10 thinking errors that lead to anxiety. Karen, is that the handout that you have for later? Okay. So we'll talk about that later. So you can go back to the welcome slide, I guess. So that's all I had for the brief overview. So now what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit more about and how I dealt with it at the time, and how I've come to terms with that particular incident, that time in my life, and what having experienced that has meant to how I recall things throughout my life from this point forward. So, as I said, when I was young, my family split, and when there is traumatic experiences, things tend to get imprinted pretty easily, and we remember them in a specific way, particularly when we're young. And I really had a hard time. Now both my parents are gone. My mother's also passed away, so I couldn't ask her about that. And my two siblings that are surviving are both much older than me, so they were already out of the house by the time that happened, or very nearly. They were a senior and a junior in high school. I was 6. So they're not going to have the same experience at that time either. So it was really up to me to work it out in my own mind as to how I was going to deal with that. There was no verifying authority, so to speak, for me to go back and back check as to, did it really happen that way, or am I making this up to make it better than it was or worse than it was? So how that has affected me in terms of other incidents, not just from my early childhood, but throughout my life, particularly in major life events like the breakup of a relationship or the changing of a job involuntarily, etc. It's had me thinking about that in a much more careful way, rather than just the feeling part of it, which is not to be minimized or set aside at all, but that's only part of the equation. Trying to figure out all the different things that I was experiencing and just working them out one by one. And it's been 4 years now, and I'm still working that out, and I probably will for a long time. So that's my basic overview on my false memories. So, Kate, would you like to say something?
Sure. So I think we may have missed the introductions part.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm Kate Zirkle. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees here at Unity Spiritual Center. And I wanted to comment on your story that would have just blown my mind. So the fact that you took 2 days, I'd still be dealing with it like 2 years later, probably. Because that's like your heritage is such a big part of your identity. So I can empathize with you and feel that how difficult that would be. So what a bias that is, right? Like a cognitive bias, like all the unconscious memories that we carry around with us. So first, let me say that, and then I don't know if you guys had any other questions for Greg before we moved on to my topic.
Anybody here? This is supposed to be like an interactive thing, so we're just not up here talking. So does anybody have any questions for Greg about what he shared?
I just have a comment. Maybe he thought they were Polish because she made pierogies and kolaczki.
It could be. It could be.
And were you going to run out with the
Yeah, I am
okay,
going.
Yeah,
I
later.
should have done that.
Okay.
It's okay.
Anybody else?
Anybody else? Okay.
Okay, so my topic is one that I think most people have experience with, and it's the overarching stereotyping, right? And so stereotyping is when you assume that you know something about somebody when you don't know anything about them. And it's an overgeneralization that our brain makes, and it can be something that you know, like you know that you have a stereotype for maybe a certain group of people, or dogs even, you could have a stereotype for, right? But it could also be unconscious, and you might not even be aware that you are, that you carry this stereotype with you. So an example for me is that many of you, if you come to Unity, you're familiar with me and my fiance Shayna. I do this to you every time, but so she's in the back, she's running AV and slides if you want to like turn around and wave to her. I like embarrassing her as much as I can. So just like looking at us, knowing that we are two women in a relationship, you might make the assumption that we are lesbians. And so we are actually bisexual women. That's how we identify. So that's just a simple, fairly harmless example of stereotyping, just looking at somebody and assuming something about their identity based on maybe having one or two pieces of information. That's fairly harmless, but one of the topics or something that's not so harmless is a stereotype about bisexual people in general, that we're all promiscuous and amoral and selfish people, and when in fact, most of us are just in normal, committed, like monogamous relationships. And so people they carry that stereotype around with them. And so really it's like, okay, let's try to get some interaction here. Let's like wake everybody up. Raise your hand if you like women, but you don't sleep with every woman that you meet. This is getting very risque for a church. You for sure don't have to raise your hand if you don't want to. Okay, raise your hand if you like men, but you don't sleep with every man that you meet. Yeah, okay, like bonus points if you raise your hand for both.
Yeah.
Okay. So we can laugh about it tonight, right? But stereotyping, especially in the LGBTQ community, it's very serious. There's a lot of violence and acts of violence that are committed against LGBTQ people for assumptions that are made, for stereotyping, for biases against them. So it's a pretty serious topic. I have another example I could go into if we want, or we have time, or anyone
We have
has
all the time we
questions?
need.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So,
So, and interrupt me if you have questions or whatever. Another example, one that's very personal to me, for my own, it was an unconscious bias that I recently brought out into the light. And it's that I was stereotyping people as being anti-gay based on having, little bits of information but not actually knowing. So for example, if I saw someone walking down the street with like a red Make America Great hat, I would stereotype them and make the assumption that they were anti-gay. Or if I'm in like Southern Ohio and I see a guy and he's driving a pickup truck and he's in full camo.
stars and bars on the back.
Yeah, sure, that. I made the assumption that he was a Trump supporter, which then my brain carried even further and was like, and so he's anti-gay. Or even at our church when we rolled out the pronoun stickers, and there were some people having issues with it in the church, why are we doing this? I somehow made the leap in my mind that, they're anti-gay. And I mean, obviously, like saying it out loud, it sounds silly. Like just because I know one thing, I certainly don't know that they hate an entire group of people. But just recently, I was able to bring that into my conscious awareness, and I'm sitting here and I don't want people to judge me negatively just based on one characteristic of who I am as a person, right?
Mhm.
So I recognize that I have to do that for other people as well, and assume and see the best in them, right? Like we're taught in Unity to see the divine in everybody, and yeah.
So those are two great stories about stereotyping, and I'm wondering if anybody here has a story that you might like to share about either how you found that you were stereotyping or that you felt like somebody was stereotyping you. If there's anything that you might like to share about your experience in that.
It's okay to admit it too, right? Like I just did, like it's okay.
Well, if anything comes up, just, yes,
Well,
there's
go ahead.
Ellen.
Yeah.
Ellen, I'm going to come back with the mic so that everybody can hear you.
Well, I just wanted to say that as a psychotherapist, I perceive that people expect me to be all wise and knowing and have all the answers and be able to help them fix issues. I'm seen as not a regular human being at all sometimes. So that's just my feeling of being stereotyped, and I kind of have to figure out what's going on with the other person if I need to for some reason. So that's all.
Yeah. Ellen, that just reminds me of how I get stereotyped as a minister, right? Like, people will realize I'm a minister and they've just sworn and they're like, oh my God, I'm sorry. Here's a real funny story. I'm a skier. We were skiing one winter and I was riding up the gondola. We were on a Meet the Mountain tour. So it was a bunch of people. I didn't know. We were on this Meet the Mountain tour. We were going up the gondola together. Somebody brings out a flask and they're passing the flask around, and just as they pass it to me, we're talking about what does everybody do. So they look at me and what do you do just as I'm grabbing the flask, right? And, so I can appreciate how you felt stereotyped because, yeah, I did. Are you kidding? All right. Anybody else? Oh, okay, great, Kathleen.
It could
For
be.
the
It could be a little bit of both of those things. Authority bias is when we confer upon someone who is credentialed or someone who we respect greatly more. I don't want to say more respect than they deserve, but that's not at all what I mean. What I mean to say is that if your medical doctor, for example, gives you information on, they're a specialist and they're your dermatologist and they're giving you information on your skin. Great, that's you go to your dermatologist for that. But then they start giving you nutritional information and you go, okay, I'll listen to them because they're a doctor. Well, maybe not, because you're giving them more authority than they really have because of some other thing. So,
Or if they recommend a restaurant.
right.
Like,
Right. So, I'm sorry.
I wanted to talk about false memories. When I was a little girl, my dad went blind. It was a big trauma in the family. There were 6 siblings. And probably 45 years later, I mean, my family always got together, but like 45 years later, we were actually talking about it, and everything that I thought happened didn't happen. I had the wrong age, the wrong details, the wrong year, the wrong month. I had everything wrong. But that created a pattern for me. So I make stuff up all the time because I fill in the blanks. But I had to fill in the blanks back then. And I just was thinking about, as you're talking about that, because it is a pattern of mine. I make stuff up all the time about people. And I think I'm right.
And the difficult part of it is our memories are a very large part of actually who we are. So when we discover that we've made some sort of error in memory, it's personal. It can't be any more personal than that. Especially if we've taken action based on a false memory that can in some way be harmful to another person because we were acting on information that was untrue. So.
Anybody else? Yeah, Kathy.
Well, it was years ago. Someone came to our church. They don't come here anymore. And I thought to myself, I really don't like this woman. I just don't like her. So one day I'm at home and I'm thinking, what is the matter with you? You don't even know her. What is going on with you? This is not right. So I started thinking about it, how you drill down. And I realized that this person reminded me of someone in my family from when I was younger that I didn't like. They just, they kind of looked like them and acted like them, and they reminded me of that. And I thought, well, that is really dumb. This is a completely different person. So then I got to know them, and I got to like them. Very lovely woman. And I thought, how sometimes it triggers something when you're a kid, something you don't like, and it had nothing to do with this lady.